Now, everyone is a person of faith. No, not in some like universalist, kumbaya, we are the world kind of way, but all of us, regardless of your background, live by faith. You have faith in science and pharmacology every time you take your pills. You have faith in the fiscal health of our economy or your individual bank when you make your deposit. You have faith in your spouse when she goes to Target with the credit card. See, because faith is confidence placed in something, and it's faith and confidence placed in something that you don't always know where it's going or what's going to happen. Now, Hebrews 11:1 would define Christian faith as faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Or the English Standard Version, the ESV, would say it's assurance of things hoped for. The NASB, the New American Standard, would say it's the certainty of things hoped for. The NIV would say it's confidence in what we hope for. Or if you go all the way back to the original Greek, it would be this word hypostasis. Or in a literal sense, they use that word as the foundational support of a building. Like a foundation. But in the abstract, it's confidence, assurance, it's certainty. It's something substantial, real, and trustworthy that underlies your faith. And so it's not like the hope that I use when I say, I hope the Lakers win the finals. No, it's believing with confidence that the thing that our eyes are set on, for us as Christians, Christ ruling and reigning sovereign over the universe, that we frankly cannot prove with the scientific method, is actually substantial and real. Now, speaking on this topic, Jesus said, you can't have confidence in two masters because you'll love one and you will hate the other. And if you are a person of faith, which I hope you realize you are, regardless of what that faith is in, you have to ask, what is my confidence in? And chances are, if you are a follower of Jesus, like you probably are if you are actually watching this right now, you're thinking, well, I know what my confidence is. I know what my faith is in. But the truth is you probably won't until it's tested. There was a time years ago when I lived in Korea. And when I lived there for the first time in my life, I was suddenly scared of fires. I didn't speak much of the language, which is pretty significant, because every day was a big guess as to what's going on. There was this one time when I was living in the South Bay. I lived in an apartment that only got TV channels from Tijuana, and I was such a TV addict at the time that I watched them anyway, and I just kind of pieced together with context clues what was happening. That was basically every day of my life all the time. I'm just piecing together through context clues of what was happening around me, my world in Korea. Now, the reason I was scared of fires was in my building, the fire alarms would just go off. The first time it happened, I sprinted into the hallway just to find that nobody else was there. So I'm like, there must be a reason. So I go back inside and consider maybe I should use the fire escape. Well, I lived on the 5th floor, and the fire escape was nothing but a carabiner on the wall where there wasn't even a rope attached to it. So I'm like, rule that out. So I started thinking through my different options. There was one elevator and there was one stairwell. I'm like, man, if there's a fire, I'm just in trouble. But the thing is, I didn't hear a single other person in my building. So after a little bit of time, I became cautiously optimistic that maybe I just wasn't going to die that day. But over time, the alarms became more and more common, and I just learned, especially if I heard an announcement over the apartment PA, just to ignore it, because thinking this must be a drill or something must be happening, because clearly nothing was wrong. But then one Sunday afternoon, the alarm goes off, and I do what I was typically doing and just not moving. But that's when I hear it, scrambling from every other apartment around me. Above me, it sounds like a herd of elephants is suddenly sprinting for dear life. I'm 12,000 miles from home. I have no family in the area. I am not rich to where I can just go to a bank and pull it. So suddenly, in this moment, deep clarification comes over me as to what I should do. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I grabbed a bag and I filled it with the following thing, with my money, my wallet, all the cash I had on hand. I find my passport, I grab my computer, and I get a change of clothes. And here's the thing, sometimes it's not until there is a moment of decision that you'll actually know where your faith lies, right? Like, I thought I might know what to do in the event of a fire, but I didn't until it became a very real thing. And for you, you might not know where your faith actually lies until you're at a moment of decision, where it's the decision and the choice between, do I tell the truth or do I bend the truth just a little bit to get out of this sticky situation? Or it's that flirtation that seems so innocent, suddenly becomes a little bit more real at the Christmas party, that you realize, like, okay, where is my faith actually in? Am I going to be faithful to my spouse, or am I going to pursue what is probably a mistake? It's not until you're at that moment of decision that you realize what you actually believe and why you believe it. Which is why there's a statement I've heard for years that is so true and that you should memorize as well. And that is, a faith that cannot be tested cannot be trusted. Now, maybe this can go without saying, but faith is really important to us. In fact, Hebrews 11:6 says, it's impossible to please God without faith. Literally, God's pleasure is impossible without living by faith. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. I mean, our very salvation from death is through faith. Matthew 21:22 says, and whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Prayer, God's intervention in our very reality and existence, dependent on faith. So here's the battleground. Who is your confidence in? Your logic or God's leadership? When you have that thing happen to you and you're hurt deeply, do you seek revenge or do you love your enemies? Man, when you have that potential bonus at stake, do I still take my Sabbath or do I work harder and more hours? When I have an opportunity to do good, am I going to lean towards generosity or stinginess? Am I going to trust that Jesus will satisfy my deepest longings, or am I going to just give in to my greed, my lust, my taking power back, etc.? This is a series all about our DNA as a church. It's the heartbeat, the thing that makes our heart beat fast. It's who we are and what we will grow into. We're spending 5 weeks about our core values and the vision for our future. Now, there are several reasons that values are important to establish, one of which is choosing to be in control of the culture we're building as a church versus just being, subjects to a culture that we have no control over. It's choosing to be thermostats, not thermometers, where we don't reflect the temperature, we set it. And this is incredibly important. In Peter Duhigg's The Power of Habit, he tells a story of football coach Tony Dungy changing the culture in Tampa Bay. See, at that point, the Buccaneers were one of the worst franchises in sports. And he changed the culture by implementing habits that took decision-making out of crucial moments. Just finish this phrase for me, and I know it's going to be weird, especially if you're not watching this by yourself, but yeah, if you said charge, it's because you've heard it so often and you've been at so many sporting events where they do it that you didn't have to think, you just reacted. And you just do it, right? And that's our goal too. We want to establish the values so that hopefully when we're at those moments of decision, we know how to react instinctively, reactively, rather than having to pause ourselves and pull ourselves into control. We can already have our decisions pre-established, right? That's the power of values. That's the power of culture. And the thing is, when you can master the little things early, you're trusted with more. Jesus told a story once about servants who faithfully managed a master's investment. And the moral of the story was wrapped up by Jesus in Matthew 25:23 that said, his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. See, here's our hope. when it comes to faith, I want it to be so automatic for us that you don't even have to think, you just react in faith. What is faith? Well, we put our confidence in God and in his leading. And for us here at First Baptist, as we establish the core value of audacious faith, we're going to say it this way. We act with a bold faith, knowing it's not about the size of our challenge, but the size of our God. Even when we don't see the path ahead, we have a confidence that God will never lead us where he doesn't want us to go. I think 2 Corinthians 5:7 summarizes this the best, and that's the reason why it's our key verse. For we walk by faith, not by sight. And the question that we ask ourselves is, is this really true in my life and in our church? Am I relying on my feelings and logic or on God? Because I'm putting my confidence one place or another. And so I know you're thinking, okay, faith is great. Well, here's the fear. Faithfulness to God does not always equate to comfort. The mantra that I'm trying to develop for myself, to turn my heart towards fully adopting, and just, it's a daily thing for me, because I don't necessarily want to, in my own spirit and my own power, actually fall into this. But the mantra I'm trying to adopt is that I would rather be faithful than comfortable. Because to choose anything over faithfulness is sin. And sin destroys everything it touches. Now, in the short term, it can give me lots of enjoyment. Right? By the route of sin, I can see a lot of fun, great things. But long term, it will lead to heartache. And so what we'll do is we often find ourselves willing to compromise for comfort. We'll settle for the wrong person. We'll settle for the wrong job. We'll settle for the avoidance of conflict. Or we'll settle for the avoidance of doing painful things, but are ultimately good. But for me, I'm thinking a close and a clean relationship with God will always be more fulfilling than anything else the world can offer. Love the movie, top 20 list for me, but Ocean's 11 is kind of a lie. They stole millions of dollars and they're all happy and fulfilled in life. The reality is making that kind of decision will not lead to fulfillment and joy. At the same time, conversely, the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, writes in prison, Philippians chapter 4, about whatever state he's in, he can find joy and satisfaction, and he is in prison. So doing the right thing will always lead towards long-term joy and fulfillment, and doing the wrong thing might create short-term happiness, but ultimately it will leave you with heartache. And we need to believe that God will never lead you where he will abandon you. And so to illustrate this further, I want to tell you a story, but I need to give you a quick history lesson on just the Hebrew people. They had their time in Egypt where they were led by Moses. And then later they had, the established kingdom of Israel, and with literal kings sitting on the throne, like David, who fought Goliath. But between Moses and David, there was this time in the middle where they didn't have any kings. What they had was a law, and God would raise up judges when necessary. And that's where names like Samson, Deborah, Barak, those judges, they kind of come into the story, if you're familiar with them. If you're not, totally fine, I get it. But if you ever read through the book of Judges, here was a typical cycle. People followed God. Things went well. Then they'd get a little cocky. They'd start abandoning God, doing things on their own, and they would get conquered. They would ask for help. God would bail them out. And frankly, this is how the story of Gideon starts in Judges chapter 1. It says, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. Not starting out great. So the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. 7 years doesn't sound that long, but 7 years is long. It's a lifetime in some sense. In fact, here are some things that were true 7 years ago. 7 years ago, Donald Trump was just starting his presidency. 7 years ago, Tom Brady and the Patriots came from behind 28-3 to beat the Atlanta Falcons. 7 years ago, the iPhone just started coming with 2 cameras. 7 years ago, only one of the new Star Wars films was out. Right? 7 years is a long time. So imagine for a second if you were oppressed for 7 years, or just like you feel stuck for 7 years. That feeling of being alone for 7 years, maybe that feeling of being unsuccessful or a loser, maybe being sick for 7 years, financial insecurity, chaos, all those types of things. You go through that for 7 years, and you probably start to ask the question, where is God in the middle of all this? Now, what really gets hard is when you start coming to grips with the fact that possibly you're in this situation because it's your own fault. Sometimes not. But no matter whether it's your fault or it's not, being stuck in an uncomfortable situation for 7 years gets your attention. So in Judges 6, starting in verse 7, we read this. When they cried out to the Lord because of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. This is great news. God is answering their prayers. Now he said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. And at this point, everybody's like, guys, right? Like, we're about to hear the message of our deliverance because we know the pattern. We call out, God rescues us. It's great. So this was the message of the prophet. I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. So far, starting out great. Verse 9, I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. Pretty good, right? Like, he rescued from the oppressors. Guys, it's coming. Prophet keeps going. He says, I drove out your enemies and I gave you their land. You're like, yes, Lord, I hear that. I claim it. Do it again, God. Verse 10, I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live, but you have not listened to me. And he's like, all right, I'm dropping the mic. I'm done with this. And from their perspective, like, we just called out. God answers back. And this was his message. Guys, it's kind of your fault. Womp, womp. Does this mean that God is like removing himself from the situation? This is what a lot of the Israelites are kind of wrestling with. But then in verse 11, it says, the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Oprah. Yep, just even around even back then, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. And Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. I don't expect you to get this, but threshing wheat can't really happen at the bottom of the wine press. Because literally it was like, you had like this pitchfork looking thing, and you would scoop up the wheat and you would throw it up, and like the wind would blow away all of the dust and the dirt and all that kind of stuff. And then the wheat itself would fall back down. Like, you needed wind, and there's no wind at the bottom of a wine press. It's like a well of some sort. And so to be called mighty hero is potentially a very condescending thing. And this isn't just happening by, just some jag. It's the angel of the Lord. Or rather, it's like an Old Testament appearance of Jesus, the technical term, theophany. Now, Gideon has this conversation with the Lord, and of course, this conversation is full of objections. And in his defense, I don't think he actually believed he was talking to God at this moment. But then in verse 14, it says, then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. But Lord, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. And the Lord said to him, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. Just so you know, Gideon's objections don't stop. In fact, he asked for multiple signs for God to prove that this was all true. There's one point where the angel of the Lord disappears after one of the miracles, and he realizes he was talking to God, but his fear doesn't completely recede either. And so he asks for a sign where he places a fleece out, and he asks that God confirm his promise. Right? He's like, okay, God, maybe you can make the ground dry and the fleece wet. And then God says, okay. So he confirms it, and he follows through. And this was Gideon's response. Okay, that might have been too easy. Let's reverse it. Let's make the ground dry. Let's make the ground wet. Let's make the fleece dry. And God does that too. We often find ourselves becoming condescending with people who doubt God. But God doesn't become condescending towards those who doubt him. In fact, if you look, God is patient with our doubts. If you are honest, he was patient with your doubts. Not only is he patient, he is kind in those doubts. See, what he asks for is obedience and trust. And for Gideon, he's scared, but he's following through. He keeps taking the next step, even in his fears. The scared weakling who was hiding in a wine press is now openly recruiting an army. And he goes and he does it. And miraculously, he gathers 32,000 people. And then God tells him, Gideon, that's too many people. Judges 7:3 says, therefore tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid, they may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. God's plans don't always make sense to us. But that's not for us to decipher. What he's doing is he's asking for our follow-through. In fact, the army is reduced even further. And by the time it's all said and done, Gideon, who acted on faith to try and recruit an army to go to battle, finds that there are only 300 left to contend with the Midianites who've been keeping them under lock and key for the last 7 years. So, of course, if you're Gideon, you would be scared to death. And he is also scared. He's fearful about his chances. And you would be too. So it's 300 versus a whole army. So God tells him, hey, sneak down to the Midianite camp. And so Gideon, he gets down there in the dark of the night, and he hears two soldiers who are on patrol have this conversation. One shares that he had this dream where like a loaf of bread came rolling down a hill and had knocked over their tents. Sure, whatever. Like I have weird dreams too. But this was the conclusion that Gideon reaches after listening to this. It says, when Gideon heard the dream in verse 15 and its interpretation, he bowed and worshiped before the Lord. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and he shouted, get up, for the Lord has given us victory over the Midianite hordes. For Gideon, it's exactly what he needed to hear. So everyone gets their lit torch, they put it in a clay jar, they grab the ram's horn, they circle the camp, and at the moment, Gideon gives the signal. They blow their horns, they break their pots, and immediately pandemonium breaks out in the enemy camp. In fact, the Midianites start fighting each other because they're just so confused with what's going on. They do like 99% of the work, and that's when the rest of the Israelites step in, and the 300 who are left chase the Midianites out. And at the end of the story, here's what we can figure out. Gideon is filled with doubt and fear the whole time. And he asks for God's confirmation repeatedly. But he just keeps taking the next step. Over time, God's requests get more and more ridiculous. I mean, it makes sense initially. Build an army, I'll give you victory. It's like, okay, I can see how God can do that. But then the requests get more ridiculous. No, you have too many people, get rid of them. Now you only have 10,000. 10,000 pales in comparison to what the Midianites have, but sure, you know what, maybe 10,000 can do it. But nope, that's still too many. It's got to be 300. And every step of the way, Gideon is terrified. Even to the start of the battle, he doesn't know how God's going to follow through. And God's gracious to him again and allows him to hear the interpretation of that dream. Or he doesn't hear the interpretation, just hears the dream, and he's able to interpret it, that God is going to be with him every step of the way. And in the process, he's like, I'm just going to stay more and more faithful. See, for us, when you trust in the small, you'll see the miracle in the big. Here's why I believe faith is smart. Faith is smart because God is bigger than our circumstances. Faith is smart because God is bigger than our excuses. And faith is smart because God is bigger than our resources. See, for us, faith is like a muscle. See, what was once scary and hard, over time of exercising it, becomes easier. And suddenly you find yourself trusting so much sooner. See, where you used to stress, now you sleep easy. What looked impossible now seems probable. And here's the thing, you start to come to grips with the fact that what if my pain isn't an evidence of God's absence? What if it's the precursor to God's miracle? It starts by exercising that muscle of trust and faith. See, faith is actually positioning yourself for the miracle. See, when you take that next step, even when it is scary, even when you don't know how it's going to turn out, but you know for sure that God is pushing you in that direction, when you take that next step, you are perfectly positioned for the miracle. Faith is also the safest spot to be in. But you have to redefine what safety is, because it's not about avoiding pain. It's about being the most secure you can be in the long run. See, my hope for us is that we have audacious faith on a personal level, where every single one of you who live this out find yourself automatically and instinctively doing the thing that God has called you to, even when you don't know where it's going to lead. And that's difficult and it is hard. But the reality is it is smart and ultimately it is safe. Not because you're going to avoid pain, but because to do what God is calling you to do at the time He has called you to do it in the way He wants you to is the precursor to seeing Him add to you. Because if you're faithful in the small, He will keep adding. But I don't want this just to be true at the personal level. I want this to be true for us at the church level as well, right? Like for all of us collectively. That I dream of us being the type of church that says, yeah, we don't always know what our future is going to look like, but we will be faithful in it. That even when it looks like it's going to cost us something, if God's calling us to do it, we're willing to write that check. That we believe so strongly in God's leading and doing the right thing that we will not cower within our own doubts and fears, which we will still probably have. But by taking that right next step, we'll find that we're positioned for something way beyond our capacity and way beyond our ability. So let me pray for you. God, I'm asking right now that those who are listening on the other side of the screen right now would find themselves filled with faith in spite of their fears, in spite of their doubts, that God, you would give them their right next step, and God, today they would take it. And I pray this in your name. Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us for Church Online today. If this is your first time watching, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can keep getting these over and over. We are going to be continuing this series over the next couple weeks and look forward to continuing this journey with you. Hope that you have a great weekend. And if you took a next step, don't forget to go to fbcsd.com/nextsteps for more information on things you can take. All right, see you guys next week.